Today, I want to talk about one of the most underutilized and least known of commercially produced Browning cartridges, the 9mm Browning Long. We'll look at its origins and briefly explore how the decisions of Colt and FN conspired to miss out on one of the most lucrative ammunition markets of the 20th century. And remember, if you think I'm wrong, fight me in the comments. If you can prove I'm wrong, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. The 9mm or .36 caliber has a long history going back to muzzle-loading firearms, although it was not widely used prior to the mid-1800s. For a brief overview of how the .36 caliber became known as .38 caliber within the U.S. during early adoption of metallic cartridges, please see our video on the .38 Super. In short, this was thanks to Samuel Colt, who never let such trivial things as truth or grammar stand in the way of a good sales pitch. About the same time that Colt was establishing his firearms empire, European acceptance of 9mm was growing with the use of pinfire cartridges. Similar to the U.S. market, however, the 9mm was something of an intermediate, with small and larger calibers being more popular. This was especially true of European militaries, which preferred a minimum of 11mm. The story of the 9mm Browning Long doesn't start in Europe, as one might expect, but rather in the hills of Ogden, Utah, with John Moses Browning. Between 1894 and 1896, Browning completed 4 large-frame pistol designs which fired a cartridge based on the .38 Smith & Wesson, known in Europe as 9x20mm rimmed. Throughout his career, Browning maintained a close working relationship with the Winchester Ammunition Department and would work up his own loads and modify cartridges before sending them to Winchester for production samples to be made. However, Winchester had an agreement with Colt to stay out of the pistol market, so Browning took his pistol to Colt's, who were also developing his machine gun prototypes. Colt did not have their own ammunition facilities and typically relied on the Union Metallic Cartridge Company for cartridge development. The earliest surviving development records of Browning's cartridge come from the development logs of UMC in August of 1896, around the time that Colt purchased patent rights to produce Browning's pistols in the U.S., but provide little detail. The oldest surviving cartridge comes from a Winchester production sample dated to 1897. It is rimless and straight-walled, with a .385-inch diameter and .770-inch case length. Overall length is 1.166 inches. Bullets appear to be .357, as used by Colts, but have not been studied to determine exact size or weight. These cartridges, along with Browning's pistols, would travel across the Atlantic during 1897 to FN in Belgium and DWM in Germany. At that time, DWM owned a controlling interest in FN, and permission had to be obtained before production could begin. DWM rejected all of Browning's full-size pistols to avoid competition with their own C93 and C96 pistols already in production. No objection was raised for FN to produce a .32 caliber pocket pistol, however, and development would result in the FN Le Pistolet Browning, later known as the Model 1900. That model would quickly become one of the most successful commercially produced pistols in the world, and solidified a relationship that would later see Browning named as chief engineer of FN, despite spending roughly half his time over 5,000 miles away. One of the biggest reasons Browning had brought his pistols to FN in the first place was Colt's lack of interest and delays in developing his designs for production. Colt had purchased production rights to all 4 of Browning's first pistols during 1895, but was only willing to develop one design with the hope of securing continued military contracts. Browning's short recoil, dropping barrel prototype would linger in development until starting production as the Colt Model 1900. Development in 1898 between Browning, Colts, and the Ordnance Department can be seen in another Winchester cartridge sample, dated to the same year, in which it has been lengthened to a case length of .897 inches and overall length of 1.303 inches and made semi-rimmed. These changes brought the cartridge up to specification for the standard revolver cartridges in current use by the U.S. military. It is not known if this was done in an effort to standardize cartridges among pistols and revolvers, or simply for cartridge production equipment. Both are equally plausible, although records to support either theory are not known to exist. Early production would see a slow, incremental increase in bullet weight from 105 to 130 grain. While Colt and FN were developing their respective Model 1900 pistols, Browning designed yet another new pistol action. During 1900 or early 1901, Colt, seeing the immediate success of Browning's pistol with FN, requested a similarly sized pocket pistol. At the same time, FN requested a larger pistol which would be more suitable to pursue military contracts. Browning decided to meet both requests by utilizing the same basic design. Prototypes of both models were completed by April 1901, with a .32 caliber for Colt and a 9mm for FN. While a blowback design seems very out of place for a military pistol with current perspective, it was not unusual at the time, and the cartridge had comparable energy to that of most service revolver cartridges. Additionally, it must be remembered that DWM still maintained a controlling interest in FN, and the blowback action was less likely to be seen as a direct competitor to the C96 or the new Luger pistol. The 9mm cartridge for the new FN Grand Model was little more than the semi-rimmed .38 ACP, shortened back to approximately that of the original prototype. Case length was 20mm or 0.80 inches, with an overall length of 28mm or 1.1 inches. It used the same round-nose bullet as concurrent .38 ACP, which was 110 grains. Apart from the samples made by Browning himself, cartridge development appears to have almost entirely taken place with FN in Belgium, with no known surviving records. The earliest available record of the cartridge comes from the 1903 and 1904 Swedish pistol trials, and show that velocity of the 110 grain bullet at that time was 1,100 feet per second. This was nearly identical to the concurrent 9mm Parabellum, which in 1904 is recorded as firing a 123.5 grain truncated cone bullet at 1,077 feet per second from a 120mm or 4.72 inch barrel. Had FN committed to production of the pistol and cartridge when presented in 1901, they may well have beaten DWM's 1904 release of the 9mm Parabellum, and the cartridge we know as 9mm today may have had a very different origin story. FN, however, had learned a bitter lesson during production of Browning's first pistol. They had set up commercial production before the pistol went to military trials, and the resulting changes to the design presented an enormous cost in subsequent changes in tooling and the necessity of operating two concurrent production lines for the Model 1899 and 1900 for nearly 2 years. To prevent such financial overreach in the future, FN adopted a policy of not setting up full-scale production until a significantly large order had been placed to offset the cost. This would delay release of the pistol and cartridge until 1907, when it was adopted by Sweden, despite earlier requests of several hundred pistols for field trials by both the Swedish and Norwegian militaries. The delay would also contribute to the name of the cartridge. By the time the 9mm Browning Long was in production, the .380 had also been developed and would be known in Europe as the 9mm Browning Short. The FN Model de Guerre, now finally in production, would never see the same success as other Browning designs produced by FN, with only 58,442 leaving the FN factory between 1907 and 1927, with a 5-year gap during World War I. Sweden would be the largest purchaser, but it was also adopted by the police forces of Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and later Turkey, Estonia, Paraguay, El Salvador, and Colombia, as well as less than 100 being ordered by both the Dutch and British Navy. During World War I, when the FN factory was occupied by Germany, Sweden would set up domestic production with Husqvarna and go on to produce nearly twice as many pistols as FN between 1917 and 1944. The pistols were later put into storage for reserve use once Sweden adopted the 9mm around 1940. From 1986 to 1988, they would again be put to service use after a batch of submachine gun ammunition started breaking their current service pistols, resulting in at least one instance of a slide striking a soldier in the face. They were shortly replaced with the Glock 17, much to every service member's relief. Specifications for the Swedish military from 1960 show that virtually no development took place throughout the lifetime of the cartridge. It maintained a jacketed round-nose 110-grain bullet with a velocity of 1,115 feet per second at a pressure just under 35,000 psi. This is not surprising, given that it was already at the upper limit of the pistol it was designed for, and appears to have only been chambered in one other firearm, the Swedish M37 submachine gun. The cartridge that had two opportunities to be the original 9mm automatic instead faded into obscurity, in the shadow of the Parabellum's rapid advancement and wide application. The sale of pistols as surplus into the U.S. market, however, has given this cartridge a small revival. While imported pistols were rechambered for .380 due to the unavailability of ammunition, most collectors have since returned their pistols to the 9mm Browning long, with original Swedish replacement barrels, which can still be found. Ammunition, albeit relatively expensive, is currently available through online sources, but appears to only be produced by PPU. If you know a trusted reloader, though, cartridges can easily be made by trimming .38 Super brass. If you have one of these, don't be afraid to shoot it. They're an incredibly robust design, and replacement parts are surprisingly available for its limited production numbers.